As you heard, my name is Gareth, and before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Samantha Lee and Professor David Mackey, for their contribution to this work. So I'm talking about myopia as well. You heard from Bree earlier about the work we're doing in Raine Generation 3. This is using some of the data we collect as part of the Raine Generation 2 20-year follow-up to develop eye growth charts. So in the what we'll call the healthy eye, someone who doesn't wear glasses, light should enter the eye and become focused on the retina there, and that will give you a nice clear image where you can see things clearly. In myopia, the eye is too long, so it's grown too long, and the focal point is in front of the retina, and that means that things far away are blurrier than things up close. And we can correct this with glasses, with a concave lens. That'll shift the focal point back onto the retina, again giving a nice clear image. But the problem with myopia is that it's not just about glasses, and the eye growth that occurs can increase your risk of complications. So things like glaucoma that affects the optic nerve, retinal detachment, and myopic maculopathy. And the risk of these conditions increases quite exponentially with the amount of myopia you have, so the strength of your prescription. So if you only have low amounts, you're probably only at slightly elevated risk. But if you have lots of myopia, so above that 6 diopter range, we call it high myopia, that means your risk is exponentially elevated of those conditions. And of course, myopia is very common, as we heard, and it's becoming increasingly common around the world, particularly in parts of East and Southeast Asia, urbanised areas. About 80 to 90% of school leavers are now myopic in those cities. And they have this huge wave of young myopic people who are at risk of these complications, and they're now getting a wave 20 or 30 years later of people irreversibly losing vision from the complications of myopia. So it's a large global issue. In Australia, we have more modest rates, around 25 to 30% of adults have myopia, but we have documented a slight increase in adults born before World War II versus after World War II. This is using data from the Generation 1 cohort of the Raine Study, where we documented about a 5% increase in those adults compared to in adults born after World War II versus before World War II. And what's causing myopia? So the myopia I'm talking about typically occurs through childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. That's the majority of myopia occurring, and that's because of eye growth during this age. And it can be caused by genes, so you might be slightly more susceptible to myopia based on a range of genetic factors. If you spend more time in the education system, your risk is higher. If you spend less time outside, your risk is higher. And if you spend more time on near work or close-up work, again, your risk is higher. And what's occurring is that your eye should grow normally during these ages, but in combination with these factors, your eye grows too long, and so you end up with myopia. Eye length, we refer to as axial length, and it's becoming a really important measurement in myopia because of its relationship to those other complications that occur. And it's increasingly being used to manage and assess and manage children with myopia. The problem with axial length is that it's not as easy to interpret. So there's a huge variety of normal axial lengths in the population, even among people who don't wear glasses. And so some of the factors that can affect your eye length, we heard from Bree earlier that your eye grows during childhood. So your age affects what we expect your healthy eye lengths to be. And we also know that males have longer eye lengths than females. And that's partly mediated through height. So taller people also have slightly longer eyes than shorter people. So it makes it harder to answer the question, well, what's a healthy axial length when you have a child in front of you in a clinic? But these sorts of problems have actually been addressed with things like height and infant length. So these are infant growth charts that many of you might be familiar with. You can measure your child up to age 2 years, and we have a separate chart for girls and for boys. And that will tell you where they sit relative to a healthy population. So you can see if they're at the 50th percentile, means they're bang in the middle. If they're at the 97th percentile, they're in the top 3% for length. If they're at the 3rd percentile, they're in the bottom 3% for length. And so we set out to produce eye growth charts so that we can use these to help assess children with myopia or at risk of myopia. And on brand for the theme of the meeting, we did this in collaboration with the Consortium for Refractive Error and Myopia. It's called the Raine Consortium. This is a collaboration with 20 cohort studies across Europe, East Asia, and Australia. And we end up with over 170,000 participants from around the world, including the Raine Study Generation 2 cohort, who represent about 1% of that. but our team has actually led the development of the charts. And so we ended up with data from about 150,000 participants, had over 500,000 measures of eye length. And so we're not actually following the same children as they develop with these measurements, but we have lots of separate data points that we're stitching together to form eye growth charts. Most of the participants were from East Asia, and we adapted the World Health Organization for growth methods to develop these charts. I haven't gone into the details, but we found that the populations in Australia and Europe were quite similar. And so we've actually developed a combined chart for Europe and Australia, whereas they were very different for East Asia. And you can see that in the bottom graphs, the centile curves, so these are the 3rd to 97th centile curves. You can see they increase much more rapidly than the Europe and Australian charts. And I'll show you a comparison in a moment. What I do want to emphasize before I go into the comparison is that these are what we call reference growth charts. So they do not define what a healthy eye length is. They just tell you what the eye length is in the population that you're referring to. So it does help to contextualize this, but it's not actually defining what's considered a healthy eye length. And to do that, we would only need to limit this to children without myopia. If we compare East Asia and Europe, Australia, you can see the dashed lines are Europe, Australian charts, solid lines are East Asian charts. And even at age 6 years, the East Asian kids had longer eyes than Europe and Australian kids. So it indicates there's some really early life differences occurring that are contributing to the high myopia prevalence in East Asia. And then through primary school, there's a much faster growth in eye length in those East Asian kids compared to Europe and Australian kids. And it then stabilizes as you get to later adolescence and early adulthood. Again, to emphasize, these are not necessarily healthy eye lengths. So if you're on the median percentile, the 50th percentile, the green line, for East Asia, you're still likely to develop myopia because 80% of kids will end up with myopia. So to actually be in the safe zone, you probably need to be below the 15th percentile. So how can we use these charts? The immediate benefit is that we're able to contextualize eye length measurements. And so if there's a child in front of you in a clinical setting, you can measure their eye length. You can compare that eye length to the population, to an appropriate population for their age and sex, and determine where they actually sit relative to the rest of the population. If they have a high axial length centile, they might be at high risk of myopia onset, they might already be myopic, and they might be at high risk of these complications later in life. We're looking at whether we can use these centile charts as a predictive tool. So if you have a child who's 7 and the 97th percentile, you might be able to, and they stay on that percentile curve, so say they stay on the red line, you can predict what their eye length might be by the time they reach 18 years, and whether treatments to slow eye length are actually effective. We are working on developing eye growth standards, so what's a healthy eye length to avoid developing short-sightedness in children. And part of the work we're doing is with the Raine Generation 3, where we can we're actually following the same children over time and measuring their trajectories early in life. So with that, I'd like to thank the participants of the Raine Study, particularly the Generation 2 cohort in this case, as well as my collaborators from both here in Perth and in the Netherlands and Ireland and around the world, and of course the funders for funding the Raine Study Fellows. Thank you very much.